If you've ever seen the HBO series, The Ice Truck Killer, then you've probably heard of Richard Kuklinski. The Ice Truck Killer is a nickname given to a serial killer who preyed on ice truck drivers. The nickname references the fact that many of his victims were abducted at truck stops, where they were then murdered and dumped inside the trucks. Kuklinski was one of the most successful and prolific serial killers in the history of the United States. He was known as the Iceman for his ability to withstand the cold temperatures during his killings. He was also called the Crying Killer because he would often cry during his interrogations. Kuklinski, who died in 2006, is one of the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century, and yet he's almost unheard of outside of New York City. This is unfortunate because the crimes he committed were truly horrifying. Richard Kuklinski was born in Queens, New York on July 29, 1936. His father was a butcher who decided to open his own business after World War II. Due to some of his father's wartime work, Kuklinski grew up in a rough neighborhood that was heavily populated by Italian Americans. This environment would later shape Kuklinski's career as a contract killer. He attended public schools and went on to college at Queensborough Community College. He dropped out of school after a few months to focus on his father's business. He worked his way up from a lowly job at a meat market to owning his own store and bought and sold various meats including tuna fish and hot dogs. In the 1950s, New York was booming. Crime was actually low at this time. New York City was the place to be for ambitious people. In this environment, many young men from bad neighborhoods joined the mafia. In Kuklinski's neighborhood, a friend of his father's was a spokesman for the local mafia organization. His friend was able to get Kuklinski an interview with the mafia. Kuklinski got this interview thanks to his father's relationship with the mafia. He was interviewed by several different members of the mafia, and finally, he met a man named Gaspar DeSico. DeSico was the boss of the Patriarca crime family, which was one of the most powerful and influential crime organizations in the world. He was attempting to branch out and expand his organization into New York's legal and legitimate businesses. The mafia was a well-known and respected organization at the time. There were many people in positions of power who belonged to the mafia. One of Kuklinski's associates during this time was the manager of a meat market who was also a member of the mafia. This man would later be involved in a key event in Kuklinski's life. After working with the mafia for a few years, Kuklinski decided to branch out on his own as a contract killer. It's not clear why he chose this career path, but Kuklinski was clearly ambitious and driven. It's important to note that, at this time, the American public was obsessed with organized crime. Movies and books about the mafia were extremely popular at the time, and people were fascinated by the idea of joining a syndicate like the mafia. The key event in Kuklinski's life that helped him gain a reputation as a contract killer came when he killed a man named Fred Katz. Katz was a successful and wealthy lawyer. Katz's death was tragic and shocking, but it also helped transform Kuklinski into a high-profile contract killer. The Daily News published the story of Katz's death, and it was picked up by other news outlets across the country. With this public exposure, Kuklinski was able to transport himself from a local killer to a high-profile mafia enforcer. Kuklinski was finally arrested in January 1985 after a huge manhunt. He was convicted of murdering 10 men and sentenced to death. The same day that Kuklinski was convicted of murder, the New York Yankees won the World Series, which helped keep the trial in the public eye. Kuklinski was the most prolific female killer in the U.S. history. He was also a cannibal who enjoyed eating his victims' brains. The world of contract murder and organized crime has always been fascinating to people. It also carries a fair degree of danger, which makes it even more appealing. Richard Kuklinski was one of the most successful and prolific serial killers in the history of the United States. He was convicted of murdering 10 men and sentenced to death. I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to subscribe.